different aspects of our call to take care of God's world and take care of our souls, and what happens when we do that, when we give generously. Culminates with reading from our gospel today, and that is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. It is Matthew's version of the story we call the feeding of the 5,000. Now, when Jesus had heard that John the Baptist had died, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were 5,000 men, in addition to women and children. This is the good news of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Will you please pray with me? Gracious and loving God, may these words of my mouth and this meditation from my heart be filled with your spirit and filled with your truth. And may it be heard with open ears and open hearts and open minds, and bring us a message that we need to hear for our lives today, for our world today, for our church today, for your eternal kingdom. There are a couple of news stories that have floated by my internet yesterday that were especially piquing of my interest. One, I'll just read it in total, goes like this. The Paradise Girls volleyball team had a championship game set for Saturday, the 10th, but had lost all of their uniforms and equipment in the fire. The girls said they still wanted to attend the game in Auburn, California, regardless of not having the proper equipment. Upon arrival, the opposing Auburn team had made each of the girls' uniforms, purchased them new shoes and pads. Not only that, they made them a meal after the game, provided each girl with a $300 gift card, gave each girl a large bag of supplies and clothing. Then they presented the team with $16,000 they had raised for them. Wow. Pretty amazing. There was another story from the LA Times, and it began like this. How do you evacuate a nursing home when the deadliest wildfire in California history is bearing down and there are 91 men and women to move to safety? Patients in need of walkers or wheelchairs, or confined to hospital beds, suffering from dementia, recovering from strokes. The fire is coming fast. Help is not. The fleet of vans that might have helped ferry everyone to safety has been turned back because of the danger. This is a story about what happened at the Cypress Meadows Post-Acute Care Center in Paradise on that morning of November 8th, and it especially circles around and focuses on the story of Sheila Kraft, who was the director of admissions. She'd been driving to work at 7:30 and started to see these billows of smoke of a fire that had begun but an hour ago, 8 miles away. And she knew that she had to get going fast. She had to find 91 beds within driving distance, and she had to find them now. In addition, she had to figure out how to evacuate the 30 staff that were there. The article says, on a typical day, there are waiting lists to get a bed at a nursing facility. But this was not a typical day. Hey, we're getting evacuated. This is happening. I don't know if you've watched the news, but how many beds do you have available? They tell me 4 females and 2 males. Okay, I'm putting it down. I'll take them. Then another facility. Hey, how many beds do you have available? The first 40 patients, the most ambulatory and easiest to move, head out about 9:30 in some of the staff cars. Then comes an order that they're to shelter the rest in place. So the other 50, all of them in wheelchairs, have to be rolled into the dining room away from growing toxic smoke. At 10 a.m., authorities come to say, you gotta go. You gotta go now. So the remaining staff members line up their cars and they lift patients out of their wheelchairs and put them in the car seats. Because Kraft is not a nurse, she can only drive patients who do not need complicated care. She has 2 women and a man, 1 stroke victim and 2 with Alzheimer's disease. They're headed to a memory facility in Chico, a normal 30-minute drive. But today, with all the traffic, it takes 7 hours. There's gridlock headed south. She considers piloting her car down a bike path through a trailer park, but that bike path is on fire. She sees there are no cars in the northbound lane, so she takes it heading south. Then she comes to flames at an intersection. She's stuck behind 2 cars, and to the left is a tall tree in a medical building, all ablaze. A fire tornado sweeps along the driver's side. It is so hot. She is so certain she is going to die. She's on the phone with her husband, saying goodbye. She's saying goodbye to her husband. She's saying goodbye to her kids. Her husband keeps saying, no, 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 I'm praying for an angel to come. Somebody can get you out of there. No, she says, it's impossible. He says, you're doing what you have to do. Keep driving people. Keep driving them. So she guns her car and jumps a curb. She makes some headway, jumps another curb, and then pops a tire. So she pulls into the parking lot of the local Safeway. She cannot find the jack to change the tire. Then she says, a little electric-powered Ford pulls up, a car that my husband and I would never own in a gajillion million years. Behind the wheel is the operations manager for Safeway in Northern California. He wants to drive her to safety, but she's got all these patients with her. So they look together for the jack and they can't find it. And suddenly the Safeway is going in flames. So she says somehow the 3 frail elderly patients and I all jam into this manager's tiny little Ford. And he points the car south. The sky is as black as night. And the article ends, a week passes, and all 91 patients have been resettled. 4 are now with family, the rest spread among 15 nursing homes and 2 hospitals. Amazing stories. This has been such a difficult week, the worst of times. And yet, as is so true, even in the midst of the worst of times, or sometimes especially in the worst of times, come these stories of sort of the best of times. The time when people come together and drop all boundaries, drop all walls, drop all fear, drop all our selfish nature. They just give, they do whatever they can, they say yes, they receive whatever's needed, they pray, they start seeing these wonky answers to their prayers. There's this coming together, this beautiful coming together that to me speaks of everything that Jesus had to say about the kingdom of God that he came to bring about. Beautiful, everybody loving one another, everybody giving what they have, even if it's more than what they think they can give, God blessing it with all sorts of amazing gifts. Of course, in the middle of this, or perhaps we can say, well, the reason that we get to hear these kind of stories, the reason that it's so oftentimes easy to be so generous and to be so receptive and to be so open to God's presence is because they're in the middle of a crisis. Crisis seems to be the time when we are most beloved community that we will ever be. Now, nobody likes to be in a crisis. Crises are all about something terrible happening that we don't expect, something that creates all sort of chaos, and every plan that we had, or every ability that we think we have, or every control that we have gets thrown out the window, and we have to improvise. And we have to improvise together, and we have to be vulnerable to one another, and we have to be especially open to whatever God might be able to do. But when we're in that place, which seems maybe like a horrible place, for God, that's really kind of a sweet space, because that's when God can do amazing things through us. It reminds me, not coincidentally, of the story of the first Thanksgiving, which I keep learning more and more about, and I'm not sure if I'll get it all straight, but as I understand it at this point in my learnings of Thanksgiving, it's all about pilgrims, these separatists, and they wanted to have their own pure Christian community here in the New World. Nobody's given it to them over in Europe. So they decided to take this grand adventure on the Mayflower. Well, that trip took longer than what they expected, and there was lots of disease on the ship. By the time they landed, which was later than what they expected, half the people had died because of scurvy, or a number had died because of scurvy. They were very sick. They ended up landing further north than what they expected. They were up in New England. They had actually prepared to be moving more in Virginia, so they had not prepared for the cold weather and the really, really bad soil. The plants that they knew, the crops that they knew how to grow, didn't want to grow in that soil, and it was too late really for any crops to grow anyway, because they'd gotten there when the winter was already starting. There was starvation. There was other diseases that they caught because this was a new environment, and they didn't have the right herbs. They didn't know how to cure those diseases. They also built homes for themselves, or a giant home for themselves, that wasn't adequate for the kind of weather that they had. So it was just a miserable, horrible time. And by the time the spring had come, at least half of their people had passed away. But enter into the scene a Native American named Squanto. Now, Squanto was a Native American from the Wampanoag, I can never pronounce it correctly, the tribe that I can't pronounce. And his tribe had lost, it was some other tribe, I don't remember, but his tribe had been knocked out by smallpox, probably brought by earlier settlers or earlier explorers that had brought this disease and completely wiped out his tribe. But the reason he hadn't been wiped out is because before that, he'd been sold into slavery, which was what oftentimes the white settlers, the Europeans, would come and they would capture Indians and take them back and sell them into slavery in Europe. And this is what had happened to him. And then in the meantime, he had been a Christian, he'd been converted to Christianity, and he'd been taught English, and he developed a special bond with his master who had freed him. So he came back, he was discovering that he was completely knocked out, but he met these Christian pilgrims who lit a spark to him. Like, these are fellow Christians, maybe I can help. And so he taught them what kind of crops to grow in this land. He taught them what kind of herbs to fix when they were sick. He taught them what kind of homes to build, and he got Massasoit and the Wampanoag tribe to help out, and because they were friends. And sure enough, by the time Paul came, they had come around, and they had now a wonderful harvest, and they wanted to share this with their Native American friends. So they invited all the natives that had helped them, not realizing that in that traditional culture, when you invite one person from that tribe, you invite all the people there, all their extended relatives and everything. So when everybody showed up, there wasn't enough food. So the Native Americans went back to their community and brought a bunch of venison, and then there was this great party that lasted for 3 days. Again, it's a story of what can happen. Incredible generosity, walls coming down. These pilgrims who, for one thing, were horrified and terrified about Native Americans, and who were so sure that they needed to create this pure, separate, European Christian community, couldn't have begun to get their dreams come true had it not been for these natives that were so scary. and a unique bridge of Christianity that Squanto still maintained after all the horrible things that his Christian masters had done to him. Who can explain it? But that's how it worked. It kind of speaks all of it to me of what I call the deal. The deal, if we want to live in the abundance of God's love and the abundance of God's life. It takes us being willing to give of what we have, maybe even more than what we think we can give. It means being willing also to receive what others give to us, especially if it comes from a surprising other. It means lathering up what we are giving and what we are receiving in God and God's Spirit. And it means allowing us to be open to the idea that we are in some kind of crisis. Now, crisis has a bad connotation, I know, but we can also think of crisis meaning the two Chinese symbols of challenge and opportunity. So we can see in our lives that in every moment there's a challenge, but also there's an opportunity, and that opportunity is about giving, about receiving, and about God. That's the deal. And when we don't have the deal, when we don't have those parts together, things can begin to unravel, and unravel pretty badly. One of the hardest things to read about, after reading about the first Thanksgiving, is to read about what happened subsequently, a generation after, when Squanto wasn't around, when wealthier Puritans were coming to settle. They now came more prepared, more wealthy. They came with bigger ambitions, and they came to take as much land as they possibly could from those evil, satanic natives who didn't profess Christianity. So they came in and massacred villages in horrible ways, did horrible things to the bodies. It's one of the reasons that many Native Americans now refer to Thanksgiving as the Great Mourning. And perhaps one of the best things we can do this Thanksgiving season is attend one of the powwows that are happening and just be in community with our Native American friends and neighbors. It's important for us to hang on to the promises of the deal. And that's why we have in our scripture this story of the feeding of the 5,000. And it's a story that shows up not just once in our Gospels, but it shows up in each and every one of our Gospels. In fact, there are very few stories in our Gospels that we find in each and every one of our Gospels, because each Gospel has its own argument to make about why we want to follow Jesus and who Jesus is, depending on what community is writing it and for what circumstances. But we have a crucifixion and a resurrection in each one of the Gospels. We have Jesus coming into the temple and turning things over, and we have the story of the feeding of the 5,000. It was a very, very important story. And as you probably know before, as you've heard again, it's a story that takes place when, a miracle that takes place when those who have a little give what they have. Maybe it's more than what they thought they could give because they're in this deserted place. They're in the middle of a crisis. What are we going to do to feed all these people that have come to listen to you and to receive your healing? What are we going to do? Jesus, send them out. And Jesus says, no, give what you have, even if it's more than what you think you can give. Just give it to me. And he blesses it. He lathers it in God's Spirit. God's Spirit that created the world with just a few words. And we don't know if it's just the disciples that did that, or if maybe as the disciples are giving what they have, other people realize, oh, I have something too that I could give. And I'll give. So often, if we've been in an experience where there's scarcity and we need something right away, it's amazing how it just comes out of the woodwork. It could very well have worked that way. In addition to all this Spirit that God provides that makes amazing abundance, we don't know how. And all these people were served and fed, and not only that, there's leftovers. There's tons of leftovers. It's an absurd story about how the deal totally works. And I think it's a great last story for us to listen to as we think about the commitments that we want to make this year. The commitments that we want to make in all ways, but especially our financial commitments. That's what today is all about. And we've been talking a lot about how we want people to give what they can, maybe give a little more, to move towards that idea of tithing, of giving 10% of our income, which is a biblical amount. It's not a rule, it's an amount because it's a great amount. And when we actually reach that amount, it can be totally, completely transformational. We can say that from my own experience. We want people to move towards that. And move towards that and bathe it in God's Spirit, because God can do amazing things. And to let ourselves think a little bit about what crises we might be sitting in the middle of right now. And not to be scared of them, but to see these as challenges and opportunities for discovery of the way God's abundance works. There, perhaps we could think about a crisis of discipleship, that our faith is feeling kind of comfortable or kind of lax or kind of lukewarm, and we want something to really pick ourselves up and to move us into a deeper part of the zone. There's nothing that will do that better than a sacrificial commitment to our finances. So we can think maybe about how we want God to work with us in that crisis. We can also think about a crisis of ministry. We have so many wonderful things that we do here at the church. We feed hungry people. Yesterday at Joshua Tree, we fed over 75 people, with lots of people helping. We are feeding people here at the church all the time. We are becoming more and more involved in bringing ministry to our LGBTQI community. We're starting a ministry of reading to kids in Desert Hot Springs. There's so much that we want to do. And that's the challenge, and the opportunity will come as we have the financial ability to do that. So again, that's, and lathering that in God's love, there's no telling what we might be able to do next as we respond to that. There's also a crisis of community. We're at a time when there's so much antagonism between people out in the world, and how can we be a beacon of hope where we all give to one another, give for the world. We are just nothing but generous and accepting of one another, and showing the world how beautiful community works when we give sacrificially. And perhaps we're in a crisis of finance. We are feeling like, well, I sure wish I could give something, but I just don't have anything to give right now. I've got so many bills and so much going on, I just can't give. We totally understand it. That's always on the journey for all of us. But I invite you, if you're in that place, to let yourself see that as a challenge and an opportunity. To open yourselves up to saying, well, God, when will I be ready to give? Or is there maybe just a little something that I can give right now, and a commitment that I can give later? How will you keep me on target to remain in my discipleship journey, even if I can't right now move towards tithing? That's an important opportunity, an important crisis to be into. We have had such fun over these past few weeks doing these fun little sketches and imagining ourselves on a ship, on the stewardship. It's a clever thing. But it's also very meaningful because ships are all about interdependence, right? That's the only way that a ship can survive is if everybody is doing their task and letting someone else take over and with clockwork precision. And that's what we want you to continue to think of yourselves being as we continue to worship today. And maybe continue also feeling joyful for all the fun that we've had with these sketches. I can't thank Jeremy and Annette and Dick and Melinda and Brian and Wayne and Alana and Sarah and Rex, who could forget Rex, for all the fun that all game they've been, and all the fun that they've contributed to our sketches. And I want to thank you for being so receptive and enjoying them so much. I think that we have such a bright future ahead with all the dreams that we have, all the abilities that we have, all the resources we have, with the discipleship journey that we have, and with the joy that we have. We have so much fun together. And I really feel like we can continue to move mountains and continue to laugh and have a great time as we do it, as we take seriously the deal. Giving, receiving, Spirit and embracing